Welcome to Journey Through Time. I'm Sarah Churchwell.
And I'm David Olusoga.
So, David, this is an unusual way for us to open the podcast. We are backstage at the O2, as those who are seeing us on video can see. Words I thought I would never actually say, backstage at the O2, but here we are. And I think you should have the honor of explaining why we're backstage at the O2, because it's all down to you.
We're here because I've just come off stage interviewing President Barack Obama.
I mean, that is, amazing.
It sounds crazy as I say it. Yeah.
It was crazy. It was absolutely electrifying. You know, I was tempted to just say, what's it like to interview Barack Obama? But I mean, if you want to answer that question, I'll let you. But I'm assuming that would be a difficult question to answer. What does it feel like? Well,
it's the second time I've interviewed him. I interviewed him 5 years ago in Washington when he published the first volume of his memoir. It was in lockdown. It was a TV interview. So there was about 10 of us in the room. This is very different. There were 14,000 people in a rather bigger room. It felt really significant because I could feel what his words were meaning to people and how many people and how much those people who'd come wanted to hear the voice of the 44th president of the United States. It was really remarkable. In terms of him, he seems exactly the same. He is, as I remember, he is taller than me, better looking than me, and more articulate than me. So it's exactly the same.
Does he have a crushing handshake? Does he have a competitive crushing handshake?
Well, I couldn't shake hands with him the first time we did the interview.
Because it was the
pandemic. He is incredibly charming, incredibly articulate. It's actually the third time I've seen him because I filmed him in 2012 when he was on the campaign trail for his second term. I filmed him. He was giving a talk in Charlotte in North Carolina. Okay. So I've seen him 3 times. He's everything you expect him to be. Yeah. He is a remarkable figure. And it is one of those moments. My daughter was here this evening. And I do think my father interviewed Barack Obama is the sort of thing my daughter will be saying many years from now as an old woman, because I think he is a historic figure. Yeah,
no, I don't think there's any question that he's a historic figure, right? I mean, he's passed that test, many times over, but
But a rare historic figure in terms of a statesman historic figure. Yeah. In that kind of very rare group of people. He's often been compared to, it's a cruel comparison, but to Lincoln, because they're both, have roots in Illinois, roots to an extent in Illinois. But I think he's that rare form of statesman who brings leadership and oratory together in a way that really a handful of people in any generation do.
One of the things that I found really striking about the talk is that, we all know what a difficult political moment we're in. And yet he is genuinely committed to hope, and he is still able to inspire a room. And from my point of view, sitting in the room with that audience, it felt like a lot more than 14,000. I got to tell you, that place felt sold out to me. I think you had 20,000 up to the rafters, but we'll find out what the numbers were. But it was rock star energy without any question. But what people were, cheering and leaping to their feet for was the messages of hope, because people are really looking for that. And it doesn't feel glib when he does it. He's not pretending that he has answers he doesn't have, but he's still saying, he was talking at the very end about it being a leap of faith, but that he still needs to make the leap of faith. And I think people just really are responding to that.
I think it shows the depth of the desire to see proper leadership, but also to have fundamental ideas about democracy, about civic life, the rule of law, the respect of debate, the traditions and the function of democracy respected and even celebrated. In some ways, it's a sign of how bad things are, that even stating basic realities of how democracies are supposed to function is something that people need to come to the O2 to hear reaffirmed. I think it shows that we're in a bad place. But the thing which really struck me was his idea of 2 visions of America and 2 visions of how societies work. One based on caste and tribalism, and the other based on a civic idea of shared identity.
Yeah, and he came back to that a few times, didn't he? And he had different ways of articulating it. And one was that another way that he talked about it was in terms of a society built around trust and one built around fear, and that we have both of those possibilities in us.
Yeah.
it's which messages and which conditions are encouraging us to move in one direction or the other. And I think a lot of what he was doing was certainly being empathetic to people who don't have the same political position that he has, and understanding why they might be, and urging that kind of empathy, wasn't he? You know, saying that we need to keep finding those connections with each other. But he certainly has been, you know, in the U.S. he has been accused of kind of skirting some of the difficult issues and not wanting to name names and not wanting to get specific and stuff. And what was your view on kind of whether he was getting to grips with what the issues are that we face, or did you feel that he was doing any of that kind of skirting around things that the people have been frustrated by?
I think he was very direct and very much ringing alarm bells about the dangerous position that America's in. I think he used a phrase that I know will have struck you about blood and soil, that there was a version of nationalism, a version of America that is based on caste and an idea of racial and social hierarchies, gender hierarchies. I mean, blood and soil is a very, very loaded phrase. And it is quite a thing for Barack Obama to use that phrase to describe a version of America's past and possibly America's future, which has been articulated recently by, among other people, the vice president.
I was very surprised and I don't want to say pleased, because it's such a, as you say, it's such a loaded and such a painful phrase that it's very difficult to be in a position where we need to acknowledge that that's a reality that we're talking about.
And we should state it's a phrase that comes out of European fascism in the middle of the 20th century.
And indeed, it's really important from an American history standpoint, from my point of view, that we also acknowledge that it was a phrase that was very active in American fascisms, as you know, in the interwar period as well. So it has an American history. He was not importing a European history into that conversation today. And I agree with you, actually. I kind of expected him to play it safer than he did. And I was actually really pleased that he came to grips with some of those issues. One of the other things that he did a few times was he talked about the ways in which violence emerges when those stories that we have about a society that's based on trust or one based on fear, if the systems we have to manage those differences, though I think it was the way he described it, when those break down, that's when violence erupts. And that's really what we're talking about in the story that we're talking about tonight as well, which is it's our first go at the American Civil War, isn't it? That's exactly what happened there. It was when the systems that were supposed to manage that broke down, and then violence erupts. But of course, everybody in the room will have been thinking about the violence that's erupted in the U.S., you know, in the last week as well. I mean, he didn't want to talk about it for obvious reasons, but it was there. He began the conversation by talking about America being in an inflection point, was his phrase, right now, which I think you said is a phrase he's been, you know, using. Yeah,
he used it last week in a talk in Philadelphia.
It's a really good phrase, I think, for where we are. And the story that we're telling about over the next few episodes about one aspect of the way that the Civil War in the U.S. broke out is really also about a series of inflection points, right? Recognizing that you're at this moment where certain choices will tip you one way and other choices will tip you another way. Yeah. Right? And the wrong choices tip you into civil war. But what we really wanted to do with this first go at some stories about the American Civil War, it was thinking about the ways in which those inflection points also had international dimensions, because we're here talking about American history in the O2 in London, and thinking actually about how the American Civil War also had huge ramifications here in Britain.
Yeah, the idea we've had is that we're going to do 3 episodes on Britain's relationship with America during those years of the American Civil War, the ultimate inflection point in American history, but something that was absolutely fundamental to British politics, British economics, British life during the 1860s. And you know, civil wars are far more global than we often imagine. It's also a story, the American Civil War, that gets us to another issue which came up tonight, which is this idea of a special relationship. I asked President Obama about the special relationship between Britain and America, which I think, you know, he agreed that such a thing exists. But it is a 20th century story. I mean, we've just been in an event in which an American president spoke in London. Earlier last week, the current president was also here in the United Kingdom. This is not historically normal. And I think we've projected back into the 19th century the idea that American presidents and British prime ministers would naturally interact with each other, and that, of course, people would turn up to listen to an American president in Britain. This is a historically unusual phenomenon. that American presidents are such important figures in British cultural life and political life.
And indeed that it's so friendly, because a lot of the history of that relationship over the course of the late 18th and 19th century is one of open warfare, and where there isn't open warfare, of great hostility and tension. And one of the sets of inflection points that we want to talk about in these stories about Britain's relationship to the American Civil War is a series of tipping points about whether Britain might not go to war on one side or the other of the American Civil War, whether it might not get involved and take sides, so that it would be an active participant in the hostilities. This idea that the United States and Britain are these kind of natural allies. Well, we've had, it's not just the wars that we fought against each other, but the ways in which, hostilities like the Civil War prove that it's a kind of easy mythology that we have. But he did talk about the ways in which the special relationship is also deeper. He talked about...
That was really interesting.
Right?
I was really pleased to hear that there's a different and deeper form of special relationship, which is ideas of American liberty that exploded in the revolution of the 1770s were expressions of older British ideas of liberty.
Yeah, which, as he said, come out of Magna Carta, come out of the English Constitution. And that's something that we don't teach, in my experience anyway, in American history very well at all. Maybe a little bit, but not really. Like, we don't really learn about the English Constitution in school in the ways
this
that...
This is the 1688 Glorious Revolution, the 1689 English Bill of Rights, and lots of things that we see as very American. Actually, you can see being written down in London in 1689. The idea that taxation and representation are naturally interlinked. The idea that government should be naturally limited. These are ideas about the rejection of the power of monarchs that came after the Glorious Revolution. And they just sound so American. Yeah. And of course, they were British ideas. And
this is literally what caused the American Revolution, because the British colonists saw themselves as Englishmen with the constitutional rights of Englishmen. And they felt that the crown was abrogating their rights as Englishmen. And that's why they finally rebelled, which is, again, something that we don't teach. Yeah. And you have to understand the English constitutional history and the history of the constitutional monarchy to understand how all of that unfolds. But
it's great that he brought that up, that it's not just about a diplomatic relationship, which, as these episodes are going to show, is not that old. No American
and not that stable, as we're saying.
And may actually have been a brief period. But that there is a deeper idea of political and cultural kinship. And that idea of kinship is talked about during the Civil War in Britain by people who are nervous that some form of intervention will break that kinship. Yeah. So the idea that whatever presidents and prime ministers are doing, there is a deeper relationship between the people of this island and that continental nation. I think it's wonderful that he brought that up. And it went down really, really well.
It did.
In the O2 in front of 14,000 mainly British people.
It did, and people really wanted to hear it. But I think what he also did, at least certainly for me, was bring alive to the room the ways in which those shared values and the shared tension that he was talking about between the efforts to have a society built on trust, but recognizing that that is a difficult thing to achieve and that it has never been fully achieved. And then the older version of a society built on fear, which is, maybe a more tribal thing that we can kind of default into, recognizing that as the shared attempt that is happening in both Britain and in the United States, and that therefore there's a reason. To me anyway, he was implying that there's a reason why we're finding ourselves in the same political difficulties, because yes, there is a global story about how this is happening all over the world, which he talked about, but that Britain and the United States are at a specific inflection point, and that we're kind of in the same boat because because our politics are aligned in these deeper ways that
because our histories are entwined and our kinship is so deep that a risk and a political danger in America in some ways automatically finds its way to these islands. As I said, this is the second time that I've interviewed him. The first time was November 2020. It was 6 weeks before the January the 6th attack on Capitol Hill. And he did in some ways what he did tonight in that interview. He made the case for America as this great experiment, this nation trying to bring all of these people together with this story that to be an American is to believe in America. It's not about caste, it's not about race, it's about belief and engagement and commitment to this nation and its ideals. And I remember when we did that interview, I was with a team of colleagues from the BBC. It was just infectious. We came out of that interview pleased that it had gone well, but also kind of convinced, the most articulate man in the world, had made his case for why America is a special nation and this experiment is unique in all of human history. And we did what TV people do when things go well. We went out in Washington and got drunk, had a great time. The next day, we had to film some pickup shots, some shots to help us get into the interview, to make it into a TV program. And it was a MAGA march in Washington. And we filmed for about 2 hours. Myself, producer, assistant producer, camera and sound. And we concluded it was too dangerous. Not because I'm mixed race, but because we were the press. Because the abuse that we were beginning to get, the hostility. And we got on the plane, having been euphoric, having walked out of the interview and Obama made his case for the uniqueness of America. We got on the plane really frightened for that nation. And when January the 6th happened, 6 weeks later, we were on our little WhatsApp group. And I'm afraid we weren't surprised because that march terrified us. So I feel the way I did 5 years ago is that nobody can make the case for America more powerfully than Obama. But at the same time, I watch the news and I read the papers and I'm fearful. I want so much for his vision and his faith to be fulfilled. And I have to say, he's a bit less optimistic than he was 5 years ago, and that is not surprising.
Yeah. You'd have to be engaged in a lot of willful blindness to not be less optimistic than you were 5 years ago. But what he said tonight that really struck me in terms of what we've been talking about since we've been doing this podcast is he also talked about the importance of fighting against what he described as violence against truth.
Yeah, what a great phrase.
Right? And I feel like, in our little way, we've been trying to fight that battle too and talking about, how important it is that we try to get at the truth of things, because through finding those shared stories is also a way to strengthen that sense of what our common values are and what our common creed is, to use that old American word that he used at the beginning today. And so, for me, I felt like he was sort of giving us a little bit of the royals. He's not royal, but he is kind of American royalty. He's as close to American royalty as we get. And also, there's nothing I could say that would piss Trump off more than saying that Obama is the king. So I'm going to go with it.
I had to say who's the most majestic,
right?
Between the two of them.
It's not hard. I do think that value was really important for him to bring into this conversation, because that's the bedrock of any kind of shared politics, and it is the bedrock of the work that we're trying to do, and certainly of the story that we try to tell about Britain and the Civil War over the next few episodes. So, David, congratulations on interviewing Obama for the second time. I hope we can be here for the third time. And whenever that is. And I hope everybody enjoys listening to these episodes.
Thanks very much, Sarah.
So we've just had 2 American presidents in the UK within the space of a few days of each other. And that plays into the idea that this is normal. But historically, of course, it is not normal.
Yeah, it's really a 20th century story, isn't it? I mean, there were no U.S. presidents visiting the UK. You won't be surprised to hear, David, during the Revolution, that didn't happen. And immediately after the Revolution, diplomatic relations were not resumed. But in fact, it's longer than people might think. So throughout the 19th century, there were no presidential visits to the UK until 1918, as a matter of fact, until the First World War.
So all the way through the Victorian period, no American president came to London and no British prime minister went to Washington. This pattern that we have, that it's part of the diplomatic calendar, that is a 20th, 21st century story. It does not exist in the 19th, certainly doesn't exist in the 18th century. Of course, presidents and prime ministers made far fewer visits than anywhere. The idea of the foreign trip was not part of diplomacy. But there's more to it than just that. It's the fact that our whole idea that the relationships between Britain and America are somehow unlike the relationships between any other countries, that's also a modern idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's one that really comes out of the end of the Second World War. I mean, so the beloved British phrase, special relationship.
And it's important to say it is a British phrase. It's not a phrase you hear in Washington. It's not a phrase American diplomats use. It is very much a phrase the British made up to make themselves feel better.
Indeed. And it not only is it not a phrase that American American leadership doesn't use. It's not a phrase that ordinary Americans use. It's not, I mean, I didn't really think about it in those terms until I moved to Britain.
Had you heard it before you came to Britain?
Not really. I mean, I knew Churchill had said it, but I didn't know you guys had picked it up with quite so much fervor.
Wish thinking.
Yeah, it is a little bit, and so it's like the other thing everybody said when I first moved here was that Britain was punching above its weight, a phrase you don't hear as much anymore. But once upon a time, it was absolutely everywhere.
That's because our weight's dropped.
I was I didn't want to be rude, but that was my sense. Certainly, I think Americans share that sense that Britain and America have a close relationship. Definitely. We just don't necessarily use that phrase, special relationship, which Churchill coined, as we said, in 1946. But that is a post-war idea on both sides. And in fact, the longer history of Britain and American relations is really one of tension rather than one of closeness.
We've projected this idea of special relationship further back into history than it actually belongs, because that 19th century relationship is of economic rivalry, it is of hostility, repeatedly the threat of war, and is, of course, as we have discussed before, one actual war.
Yeah. We're going to keep coming back to the War of 1812, aren't we? I mean,
I think this is the third or fourth episode where the War of 1812 has returned to our conversations.
Well, it's an interesting one because it's a war that has sort of faded from popular conversation, and yet it was a really consequential conflict. For Americans who have heard of it, it's mostly because it's the war that gave us the Star-Spangled Banner, our national anthem. And that's the kind of one thing that most Americans know about the War of 1812. So it's not as if it's massively popular there either. But it's an important conflict, an interesting one, and probably one that we should tell the story of properly. But today is not that day.
No, today we're telling the story of a period in that relationship between Britain and America in which the War of 1812 was still in living memory. In some ways, the most dramatic and arguably the most dangerous years in the relationship between Britain and America, in those unspecial relationship years of the 19th century, were the years of the Civil War, 1861 to 65.
But although it was a civil war, it had all kinds of global ramifications. It was not just a domestic conflict. And the story of how Europe and other nations responded to the imminent threat of civil war and then the actuality of civil war is a really important part of how various aspects of world history play out as well.
And in the week after two American presidents have been in Britain, we want to talk about what really was the biggest question hanging over the Civil War when it burst out in 1861, which is what would Britain do? Whether
Britain would remain neutral or whether it would come in on one side of the other. Now, again, we might think that because of this special relationship that, as we say, we keep projecting back onto the past, that it's obvious that if Britain had come in on the war, it would come in on the side of the North. That was not obvious, nor was it clear whether Britain was going to want to remain neutral or to enter the conflict. And the tensions that grew out of that uncertainty are really the story that we're going to be telling now.
And to explain why it is that what Britain does in the Civil War is in some ways the big geostrategic question of 1861, we have to go back a decade, back to another episode of Journey Through Time that we did a few months ago on the Great Exhibition of 1851.
So we talked in that story, didn't we, about the tensions between Britain and America in that time, in the decade before the Civil War, which of course breaks out in 1861. And we were talking then about the ways that the American exhibitions kind of challenged British pride in industry and empire, and it created tensions, not diplomatic tensions, but it certainly created cultural and political tensions.
And what's fascinating also about the exhibition was that it gave the British press a moment to talk about not just those tensions, but how mutually dependent these two nations had come within, a lifespan away from the revolution. So when the Times reported on the American exhibits, it didn't just talk about the tensions and the disagreements. It also used it as an opportunity to say how mutually dependent the two nations were. So the Times said this: "For all practical purposes, the United States are far more closely united with this kingdom than any of our colonies, and keep up a perpetual interchange of the most important good offices, taking our manufactures, so the goods made in British factories, and our surplus population, by that they mean migrants, and giving us in return the materials of revenue and life." So this is the great British newspaper of record, saying at a time when Britain was the greatest imperial power on earth, when the East India Company controlled India, that what really mattered when it came to money and trade was not the empire, wasn't India, it was Britain's relationship with the United States. It's an astonishing quote.
Well, and what it shows, doesn't it, is it zeroes in on the fact that although we're talking about recovering that history of tension so that we don't just think there's been this kind of happy relationship ever since the revolution ended, but that you can overstate things by focusing too much on the tension too. What that shows is there's a growing sense of trade and cultural ties. There's a growing sense of what will become the special relationship. So these things aren't static, they're in flux. And we see here the British press saying, actually, this growing relationship is becoming really important to us.
Yeah, because while diplomatically, but American presidents and British prime ministers couldn't find anything like a special relationship, British money had been flooding into America for decades. More British capital left the city of London bound for the United States than any part of the empire. The reason the Times says America matters more is because more British money has been invested in building Chicago, for example, building the American railways.
We're grateful for that.
In buying land, in purchasing enslaved people, than had been invested in any part of the empire. So industry and trade really bound the United States and Britain together.
That investment was overwhelmingly in the north of the United States. But as you say, it was also very much in the South. And that is what raises the question of what Britain's relationship to the Civil War is actually going to be.
Yeah, Britain has no choice but being involved in the Civil War because of its investments in the North and in the South. But there's one industry in particular, based in the north of England, but the south of America, that is critical. And that's the cotton industry.
Yeah. In my experience, people sometimes think about the fact that the Industrial Revolution in Britain was driven by the textile industry, and about the fact that American slavery was, driven by the cotton industry, and then treat those as if they are somehow separate. But they were deeply intertwined. The 19th century cotton made up more than half of all of U.S. exports between 1820 and 1860, so in the decades leading up to the Civil War. The American economy was vastly dependent on that export of cotton, which was powering America's rapid industrial growth. So all of America's growth in the 19th century is powered by that export of cotton, and a lot of where they were exporting it to was Britain.
When we teach the Industrial Revolution in Britain, for a long time we've tended to talk about every aspect of it, apart from one. We talk about the inventions, we talk about the factory system, the coal, the iron and the steel. And what we tend to miss out is the source of the key raw material that made the Industrial Revolution possible. And that was cotton. And that cotton was produced overwhelmingly in the United States, as you say, and entirely by enslaved Africans. And that meant that there was a single global economy that linked the north of England and the south of the United States together into one economy, one supply chain, as it were. There were 2,500 mills producing cotton thread and cotton cloth around Manchester, and they employed 430,000 workers. We know that really well. It's very well detailed in the records. And the majority of those mill hands, those operators, as they were sometimes called, they were women.
In fact, Manchester had a nickname at that time, didn't it?
Well, as I'm a professor of public history at the University of Manchester, and the city was very famously known as Cottonopolis. I mean, there's some really weird coincidences which I just think are fascinating. The reason that the mills are sited in Lancashire is because it had fast-flowing rivers that could power water wheels. The reason it's got fast-flowing rivers is because there's a high rainfall. That means it's moist, which means it is the perfect environment for producing cotton, because you have to do cotton you have to produce it, you have to process it in a damp environment so it doesn't dry out and snap. The northwest of England is the perfect place on earth to process cotton, and the southern states of America is the perfect place on earth to grow cotton.
And they employed, as you're saying, a vast number of people in Britain. So the economy is incredibly dependent on that imported raw cotton from the South.
Yeah, there's a famous article in The Economist magazine that said that the income of around 4 million people either partially or fully depended on the cotton industry. They either worked in the cotton industry, or they worked in the docks or the railways, or they were involved in producing dyes. They were to some extent dependent on cotton. And 4 million people is a quarter of the population of England and Wales in 1861.
So, with that many people dependent on a foreign export, it isn't just the prospect of war that's going to make you anxious about that level of dependency on a foreign power, is it?
It was a weakness and a vulnerability that the British were aware of, but the southern states were also very, very well aware of it.
Well, the plantation owners in the South had built their economy on this export system, they knew exactly who their customers were, and they reckoned that it gave them political leverage as conflict was breaking out, didn't they?
Yeah, they looked at the statistics, which are astonishing. 1.8 million enslaved people working in the Cotton Kingdom, the Mississippi Valley. They generated around 2 billion pounds in terms of weight, 2 billion pounds of cotton, and that's billion pounds of cotton every year. Half of the 4 million enslaved people in the entire United States were made to grow that one commodity, cotton.
These are things that we'll come back to I'm sure, in future episodes as we talk about the incredibly complex ramifications of the slave economy. But one of them is the way that the North and South in the U.S. were also interconnected by these investments, and the way that the slave economy also got wrapped up in all kinds of industries like insurance and like shipping and all of the ways in which it was implicated. But cotton is sitting there at the heart of it. What all of that means, though, when it all boils down, is that throughout the 1840s and 1850s, as Americans' political tensions were rising, the big question in the United States at that time is, what is the future of slavery?
And there's a big north-south divide here, isn't there?
Absolutely. So you were talking about the ways in which the Industrial Revolution is taught here. But in the US, there's a kind of analogous version of the way we talk about the Civil War, which is how most people outside of the US understand it as well, which is as being a story about conflict between North and South. The South hold the slaves, the North don't. That's how the conflict arises. But it's a little bit too simplistic, because actually what triggered the war was the question of what would happen to slavery in the West. What would happen as the states continue to expand westward, as they seize land from the indigenous people? This huge dispute arises over whether the new territories are going to be free states or slave states. And that really is the tension that sparked the Civil War and finally tipped America into war, is the question of what was known as the extension of slavery.
And this is the issue at the heart of Lincoln's election in 1860. The South wants to defend the institution of slavery. They see the election of Lincoln as a threat. And they also see the potential of cotton as an economic weapon. And this is their calculation. If the northern states were to go to war with the South over slavery, the South believed that British dependence on southern cotton could be used to force the British government to recognize southern independence, that maybe you could even use it to provoke the British to intervene on the South side. Their calculation was that no government would allow millions of its subjects dependent on cotton to lose their jobs and to fall into destitution, that no government would stand by as the country's number one industry collapsed, and that if cotton went down, so they convinced themselves, that could lead to economic ruin in Britain, which would lead to mass employment, which would lead to political upheaval. One visitor to Britain from the South said before the Civil War that the economic power of cotton was so great that the South could create a revolution in Britain.
It's a kind of hubris, isn't it? I mean, there's this sense of pride going before the fall here, where they were so sure that it was so all-powerful that it meant that they held all the cards.
Yeah. They looked at those statistics that we talked about, 40% of Britain's exports being cotton clothing and cotton yarn, the dependence of those 2,500 mills in the Northwest on American cotton. And they extrapolated from that the idea that they, as you said, held all the cards. I mean, it's called the King Cotton idea, or cotton diplomacy. And it is one of the biggest throws of the dice in all of history. It is up there with Napoleon's invasion of Russia or Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union as one of the kind of great gambles in all of history.
Well, and when you compare it to Napoleon's invasion of Russia or Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union, we know how both of those went.
Yeah. We don't remember the gambles that actually paid off.
Well, we say that they think that they held all the cards, but I think you're right that actually it was a throw of the dice. They were shooting craps when they thought they were playing poker.
And there's a famous speech that perfectly captures this way of thinking. And we've just done episodes about Martin Luther King's dream speech, and we talked about how in that speech he echoed the language of another great speech in American history, Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. This speech is not one of those moments of great oratory in American history. It's a speech by a Carolina senator called James Hammond. He gave the speech in the US Senate, and it's famous because it exactly, perfectly captures that crazy throw of the dice. And this is the most famous passage. Talk about hubris. He says, "Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us," and he means the North when he says they, "we could bring the whole world to our feet. What would happen if no cotton were furnished for 3 years? England would topple headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her. No power on earth dares to make war upon it because," and this is the critical phrase, "cotton is king."
Cotton is king. And it is a critical phrase. It's a really famous phrase in American history as a result of this calculation. It's hubris. It's pure saber rattling, right? He's just trying to flex his muscles and show how strong they are. But it's this strategy that actually does lead to the Civil War because it's brinksmanship, because they're daring people to take them on. And the result of it, of course, is the Civil War, which in the US, some of our listeners may not realize, the Civil War remains the deadliest conflict in American history.
Yeah, more Americans die in the Civil War than the First World War or the Second World War.
I think combined, actually.
Yeah,
I think
we
the two
forget
combined.
that.
Yeah.
It's almost 700,000 combatants, plus civilians, plus enslaved people. We'll never know the total, but it's going to be north of 1 million.
Yeah. Now, although the South is doing all of this mouthing off, even they understand with this hubris and arrogance that if they go to war with the North, militarily they risk being outmatched. And so they start thinking about foreign alliances very early on. And so again, the question of what Britain is going to do becomes critical. So on that cliffhanger note, I think we should take a break. And when we come back, we'll find out what Britain was going to do. So after these decades of tension, the Civil War finally breaks out in the spring of 1861. And the reasons for that are actually important to understanding Britain's calculus as the story unfolds. So Lincoln, of course, is elected in 1860. And following that election, in reaction to it, 7 states in the Deep South secede. South Carolina, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, Texas.
They leave the United States.
They leave. They say we are no longer part of the Union. They claim that the federal government under Lincoln threatens their way of life because it threatens their economy, which, as we've been saying, is slavery. And so in early 1861, just as they're waiting for Lincoln's inauguration, you'll remember there's that lag after our election before the inauguration. In that interregnum period, their delegates meet and they form the Confederate States of America. They declare the existence of the Confederacy, an independent nation, and they draft a constitution, and that constitution protects slavery, and they ratify it in February 1861. It doesn't just protect slavery, actually, it mandates its expansion west, which is really, really important. They say it has to expand.
So there's now 2 nations, a Confederate States of America and a United States of America. They're not quite yet at war there.
No, they've declared a rival nation, in effect. They've made Jefferson Davis president. But so there they are in this very tense situation of what's going to happen. And the real question was, will Lincoln let them go? It's effectively a divorce. One partner's walking out. And the question is the other partner going to say, okay, wave and see you later? And are we going to coexist? Or is Lincoln going to fight back? That was the question for a few months. What decided the outcome and that actually tipped the country into war in the end was the fact that the Union forces, the Northern forces, still occupied some military outposts in the South, including Fort Sumter. So Fort Sumter is a Union stronghold, and Lincoln doesn't want to withdraw the troops from it. The Confederates demand withdrawal of Union troops because they've now declared themselves a sovereign nation. So this foreign nation has to remove its troops. Lincoln refuses to withdraw, and that's the standoff. And in April 1861, the Confederates open fire on Fort Sumter, and that begins the Civil War.
And the issue of what Britain will do that had been part of Southern thinking for years before this, well, that's answered in May 1861. Britain declares neutrality. It doesn't recognize the South as an independent nation. It doesn't send an ambassador to their capital, Richmond, Virginia. But it does recognize the South as a belligerent power, not quite a nation, but it does recognize that this is a conflict with two sides.
That was deeply resented by Lincoln's government because, as you say, it suggests a kind of legitimacy to the Confederate position that Lincoln was absolutely dedicated to resisting.
So the government in London has both annoyed the South by not recognizing them as an independent nation, and it's annoyed the North by saying that they're a belligerent. That's the political diplomatic situation. But there's also the public opinion issue, which is a huge part of this story.
So what was the popular view in Britain of the American Civil War?
The majority view, unsurprisingly, for a nation that had abolished slavery and the slave trade in preceding decades, was far more pro-North than it was South. And also the view was that the North would win. You back the nation you think is going to win. And there's also a view in Britain that the threat of cotton diplomacy, that King Cotton will crush the British economy, that this is going to be a short war. There's going to be no time for that to kick in. In addition to that, and we talked about the difference between diplomatic relations and feelings of kinship between people, there was an idea that the American people were a branch of British civilization. Many, many people in Britain have relatives who become American citizens. Vast amount of migration, as we read from that quote in the Times, from Britain to America. So there's a kind of sense that, the Americans, they are our American cousins.
And of course, that's true of Americans in the South as well, though. Obviously, people emigrated from the British Isles to the South, too. So the Confederacy is kind of watching all of this happen, and they're trying to figure out how can they strengthen their position. And of course, what they really obviously need are allies. They know they're militarily probably outmatched, and they're really going to need foreign aid for financial support, for military support.
And so they send diplomats to Europe to make their case, but also in some ways to tell a story of secession, of the Civil War that makes them look good. And
it's a PR campaign.
Yeah, it's a huge PR campaign. They want to get to Paris and London and Berlin, and they want to say, look, we're not who you've been told. Here's our story. What they present themselves as a people, a courageous, rebellious people who are trying to escape the shackles of an oppressive northern government, that this is about trade, it's about independence, it's about traditions, it's about the rights of states, it's about the self-determination of people. And also they want to tap in to a view, particularly in Britain, that people seeking independence are the people that you should support. In the same decades, the British were very sympathetic to the Italians who were trying to create a new nation, escape from the Austrian Empire. 3 decades earlier, the British had fallen over themselves to support the emergence of a Greek nation escaping from the Ottoman Empire. So the question was, well, if you support the Italians, you support the Greeks trying to escape an oppressive government. Why not us? Why not the Confederate States?
In making this case, the Confederates always invoked the language of the American Revolution. So they always insisted that they were the true heirs of the American Revolution. And that was one of the ways that they justified their importance. But you've just laid out all of the ways in which they said that their case had legitimacy. But conveniently, the South, when they told this story, tended to leave out one important difference between the Confederates and, say, the Italians or the Greeks as they were fighting for independence, which is why they were fighting for independence.
The Confederate diplomats who come to Europe do not want to talk about slavery. In their secession documents, they're very happy to say that this is about slavery. But when they get to Europe, they want to claim that they have left the United States. They've seceded for every reason other than slavery. And that was particularly in Britain because abolition and being anti-slavery had actually become part of British national identity by the 1850s, 1860s. Britain really was a nation that had taken on a moral position about slavery and the slave trade in the middle decades of the 19th century. That the British really saw it as part of their identity, part of their national pride, that they'd ended these institutions. The fact that a proportion of the Royal Navy was at that moment off the coast of West Africa, suppressing the slave trade, and had been since 1808, was again something the British took real pride in. So not mentioning that this is a slave-owning nation that seceded to maintain slavery is a pretty good idea if you're trying to whip up support in Britain.
Well, and the South there, I mean, you said they were happy to talk about slavery in their Constitution, but as you know very well, of course, the Constitution it insists over and over again that they're seceding because of slavery. The Confederate Constitution didn't just permit slavery, right? It prohibited any legal change to the status of slavery in the South. It insisted that there could be free movement of slaves across the states. So when they get to Europe and they get to Britain and they start saying, oh, slavery has nothing to do with it, right? It's a very, very deliberate and cynical doublespeak. They are absolutely rewriting and obfuscating the actual causes. And that becomes incredibly important to the way, not just that the relationship with Britain plays out, but of course, the way that American understandings of the Civil War have unfolded in the 150 years since it ended, this insistence that the Confederates went to war for something other than slavery. The Constitution, their own Constitution, makes clear that that wasn't true. But as you say, they couldn't come to Britain and just say that. They had to come and say, no, there are all of these other pretexts and justifications.
And there were a couple of reasons why they couldn't say that in Britain. I mean, the first was that, as I said, Britain was the home of anti-slavery. Abolitionism was part of British identity. Throughout the 1840s, 1850s, abolitionists, American abolitionists, white and black, had come to Britain and they'd used Britain as this pulpit to condemn American slavery. The abolitionists who defeated the British slave trade and British slavery just retooled their campaign and went for American slavery in the 1840s, 1850s. Frederick Douglass came and spoke hundreds of times across the country between 1845 and 1847. He was an enormous figure in Britain. Sarah Parker Remond, another abolitionist, came to Manchester and tried to say to Manchester, all of this cotton you're seeing on the streets and outside the factories, who's making that? Where's that coming from? So there was a general opposition to the Confederate States, obviously because of slavery and Britain's abolitionist identity. But the other issue was, if you have a new nation that not only is built on slavery, that's gone to war to defend slavery and has a constitution that says slavery can never be abolished, there's a pretty high chance they're going to need to resupply their population of enslaved Africans, which means they would need to restart the Atlantic slave trade. And that could actually lead to war with Britain, because Britain has the West Africa Squadron of the Royal Navy off the coast, thousands of sailors fighting the slave trade, hunting down slave ships, freeing enslaved Africans from on board those ships. British politicians, British abolitionists could actually foresee a future war between Britain and the Confederate States. So there's identity reasons, but there's also a kind of, we might avoid being dragged into the American Civil War by supporting the South, but we might end up with a war with this new Confederate slave-owning nation.
So that's a lot of good reasons for Britain to either stay neutral or to come in the war on the side of the North. But it isn't the case that everybody in Britain felt that way.
The King Cotton theory wasn't an entirely crazy theory. There were cotton traders, mill owners who supported the Confederacy. And Liverpool, the center, the most Confederate city outside the Confederacy, as it was called, more on that later, was a center of support for the South. There were some MPs who were pro the Confederacy. And some of these arguments, here we are, a romantic, noble people fighting for our rights, that did find an audience in Britain. Never a huge audience. There were pro-Confederacy societies found, as well as there were pro-Union societies. They never got that big a membership. Their meetings were never that well attended. There were attempts in Parliament by MPs who supported the South to force the government to recognise the Confederacy. They all failed. There was some support, but the nation just tended to support the United States.
So with all of that, and that kind of built-in, not ambivalence, but, you've got people on both sides. So it should have been pretty easy for Britain to just say, okay, not our conflict. We will just stay out of it.
You've declared neutrality. There's no self-interest argument in taking part. And yet the reason why Britain doesn't manage very easily to stay out of this war is because of all of the tensions that have been building up in the decades since the revolution. They all kind of burst out into the open once the Civil War starts.
Because as we said, they didn't think in terms of a special relationship between America and Britain. There's all of this there's this fluidity and volatility where it's closer and then further apart and closer and then further apart, and tensions can erupt at any point. And so this isn't a time when they would imagine a US president coming to Britain and being celebrated, the way that Obama has just been.
There's a lot would confuse them about tonight.
So much confusion that Obama would represent.
Yeah, I think Obama would be a confusing figure in so many ways to Americans of the 1860s. But there's loads of tension. Yeah, and the British, yeah. There's so much tension between the nations. There's strong anti-British sentiment. Some of this comes, again, something we've discussed in the past, because there's just been a famine in Ireland, and there are hundreds of thousands of Irish people who've now are Irish Americans, and they are furious they hate Britain.
Yeah. And there's and we've talked about this before in Black Tom episodes and other ones, about the fact that there are other communities that also have a kind of lingering animus against the British Empire. One of them is the older American communities that still identify with the Revolution, that still see this as, we're the post-colonial state. We don't want a close relationship with you. We fought a revolution to distance ourselves from you. And certainly some of Lincoln's government basically falls into that camp.
I mean, most famously, Lincoln's Secretary of State, William Seward, an extreme Anglophobe, a man of quite incredible self-confidence who really thought he should have been president rather than Lincoln. And he is extremely belligerent. Lincoln's cabinet is also nervous because at the heart of the story of the revolution is the knowledge that foreign intervention can tip the scales. It had been French involvement in the revolution that had been in some ways decisive to British defeat.
Yeah, absolutely. And they were very clear about that as well. Both sides were. Again, that's why, of course, the Confederacy was seeking foreign support. So it's very well understood in both capitals, in the North and in the South, in Washington and in Richmond, that if a European power intervenes, that could swing the war either way.
But there are some of the issues that are tensions between Britain and America in the 1860s that are kind of familiar in 2025. One of them is, of course, that Britain just doesn't have economic interests in America. It's got a land border, very long imperial land border with the US.
Indeed. Canada is actually an important part of the story of the Civil War, as indeed is Mexico. Both borders play a role in the way that the war eventually unfolded. Certainly, I think for Americans of our generation, we tend not to think about, maybe I shouldn't generalize from my own position, but I very much think about Canada as an independent nation, and I tend to forget that, particularly in the 19th century, it's very much a British colony. And so from Britain's point of view, there is this other very large colony that is the British interest, and it's an open land border, as you say, that is right there. And in fact, border disputes were one of the sources of that ongoing tension between the US and Britain over the course of the 19th century.
Because the idea that Canada remained British when America had become independent, that was never something that had kind of universal support in the United States. The idea that Canada really should be incorporated into the United States, that was alive and well throughout the 19th century.
Indeed. I mean, even Seward, who we were talking about, Lincoln's Secretary of State, before the war, he kept saying that America should annex British Canada. It was, and there were many other people who agreed with him. There was a real sense that Canada should always have come in with the United States in the revolution, and that they kept looking for chances to redress that.
And there's also that idea of manifest destiny.
Yeah, well, that's very much growing at the time, right? So this famous idea that the United States should have this growth across the whole North American continent, and that this was like inevitable, a God-given birthright. That phrase, manifest destiny, emerges in exactly this period. So it's coined in 1845. So during this period, the ideas that will give rise to that phrase are very much in the air.
There is also at this moment a very dangerous way of thinking about Canada as an opportunity. Seward is reported by the British ambassador in Washington of having saying that the best thing that could happen to America during the Civil War was that Europe could somehow get involved, that if America went to war over Canada, that it might even reunite the Union, that the South might come back into the Union to defend the nation in a foreign war with the British.
Well, you were saying about how there are echoes of 2025 in the history that we're telling. And of course, the idea that going to war will unite the country under a divided or unpopular leadership is hardly a new one, right? I mean, it even has a name. Historians call it the foreign war panacea. It's the idea that it will solve everything. If we just have a foreign war, we can fix all of our domestic problems.
The other issue that was a real tension between Washington and London during the Civil War and in the years before the Civil War was around trade. And again, there are echoes with where we are now.
Indeed. It may surprise listeners to know that Americans have not always supported free trade, or maybe it won't surprise them given recent history. But in the 19th century, most Americans did not, in fact, support free trade. They supported tariffs, protectionist tariffs. In fact, that's where the phrase America First comes from in the 19th century in support of protectionist tariffs. So this, again, is an old history. And there's a tension there, isn't there, with Britain over the question of free trade.
The British at this point are almost religious in their obsession with free trade, whereas America had been using tariffs to protect its industries since the 1820s. Now, the British have slightly forgotten the Corn Laws and all of the other tariffs
you had
that
some
it
too.
had. There's a certain short memory here. But in March 1861, just before Lincoln's inauguration, the previous president, President Buchanan, had passed the Morrill Tariff, and that imposed 40% tariffs on manufactured goods. Britain was the number one supplier in the world of manufactured goods, so it was seen as a tariff against Britain, an economic weapon against Britain.
So there are all of these other tensions as well.
Yeah, the future of Canada, tariffs.
These are all important. They're all very...
Where have we heard that before?
Exactly.
The past is another country. It's almost unimaginable today, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. But although all of those tensions are very real then, and as we're saying, are very real now, they pale beside the fundamental issue.
Yeah. And the issue of slavery in some ways is kind of fumbled by Lincoln in the first part of the war. The British have no strong desire to support the Confederacy. They are opposed to slavery. They see anti-slavery as part of their identity. But Lincoln emphatically states this is not a war about slavery when the war breaks out in 1861. He also says he would not abolish slavery in the states where it existed. He says he doesn't have the constitutional power to abolish slavery. He says this in his inauguration speech. So this isn't a war that the British can find it easy to support the North, because Lincoln has said this isn't a war about the issue you care about so deeply. It's not about slavery.
Yeah, and it's really important to understand this. And I think our popular history on both sides of the Atlantic leaves this part out, but it's really, really crucial. When Lincoln said that he didn't have the constitutional power to interfere in slavery, he was telling the truth. He didn't have it. And for a lot of white Americans at this point, although this is hard to imagine, especially as you talk about how popular abolition was in the UK and how embedded it was, in the US, that simply isn't the case. And so for Lincoln, he's making a political calculation. Remember, he's running for president for the first time in 1860. It is simply not a politically popular enough position for Lincoln to win the election on abolition. So he runs in 1860 on halting the expansion of slavery that we were talking about. That's what he can run on, is to say we won't allow expansion into the West. So he runs on containment, not on abolition. Because the fact is that most white voters at the time, and particularly in the border states, the border states are a complicated part of how the Civil War plays out, but Lincoln needs to hold the border states. They simply wouldn't support immediate emancipation. So if he'd said, I'm going to run on a platform of emancipation, he was going to lose. So the historical consensus is that privately, Lincoln saw slavery as wrong, and he hoped for its eventual end. Indeed, he started planning for its eventual end. But politically and pragmatically, he had to distance himself from abolitionists to survive.
But what that looks like from London is that there's not really much between the North and the South. You have this long history of tension with the North. There are people in America talking about war with Canada. The South is connected to slavery and you don't support slavery. So neutrality is the only game in town for British politicians. It's an obvious thing to do. There's too much to lose. It's not just about cotton in the South, Britain's food. 20% of Britain's grain comes from the northern states. So it's a situation where, looked at from London, what's happening in America, there's a lot to lose, but there's not much to gain. Neutrality is the obvious solution. And yet, despite that, despite having done its best to keep out of this conflict, its best not to offend either side, within 6 months of the outbreak of the war, a British Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, finds himself exactly where he didn't want to be. He finds himself sending an ultimatum, a threat of war to President Abraham Lincoln.
So I think, David, that we have to leave it there with two nations on the brink of a war that might have meant that the British Empire would lose Canada. I mean, think about the ways in which things would have played out differently. A war in which Britain might have recognized the Confederacy, in which the US might have lost the South. All kind of counterfactuals start to spin out. So we'll have to leave it there with the knowledge that despite all of this, the US and Britain are going to come to the brink of war. And so please join us next time to hear how that came about.
Thank you for listening.
See you next time.